Forum Borealis. Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the north, and welcome to Forum Borealis and a new program in our 6th series called Exploring Esoteric Philosophy. Today we have back our regular guest Joseph Patrick Farrell. He is the definition of a Renaissance man, commanding a large number of subjects, and today we will finally hear from him on matters which is covered by his formal education. His PhD in patristics is from Oxford University. He's a former professor and a noteworthy documents researcher with an incredible ability to perceive new angles from old expositions, delving into all sorts of primary sources. On the artistic side, he plays cembalo and composes classical music in the Baroque style of Bach. When it comes to books, he's like a German factory. So far he's written 33 in less than 20 years. You will find a biography and his full bibliography at our website with links to his own online presence, including his membership site called Giza Death Star from one of his early books. Now, today we have him on to discuss a subtle and profound matter that is permeating many of his books, but that he's rarely interviewed about, and that we may refer to as the topological metaphor. It attempts to decode and describe nothing less than the cosmic structure, in line with the accounts of the ancient traditions from all corners of our world. It is described in many different ways and related with different symbolism and myths, but always pointing to the same essential principles, of which numbers are probably its purest expression. You do not need much knowledge of philosophy, esotericism, symbolism, or math, etc. to grasp the discussion. All you need is an open mind and an open heart, and you will comprehend your own angle from it, like we all do. The matter is objective, but the perception of it, the grasping of it, is necessarily subjective. Bon appetit. Welcome back to the forum, Joseph.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, really looking forward to our little conversation today, because we're taking a break from our usual topics, and today you'll get to apply your original education. Because
Maybe, however much of it I can remember.
whatever they manage to beat into you.
Yeah, that's right.
So today I was thinking about free philosophizing.
Okay.
Because it is a fact that, like everyone says about you, you're a very prolific writer. You write very fast. I can hardly keep up with you as a reader, actually. But you also have this, when we observe you as an author, there is this phenomenon that I mentioned, that you handle very many different subjects. And many people do this, but you handle it with depth, precision. And this too makes you stand out. And one of those approaches or aspects to your authorship that people appreciate that hasn't been, I think, enough explored in interviews is the philosophical side, because it's right up there with people who only write about these things. And by the way, I have to confess that, and this is just a personal choice, has nothing to do with religion or morals or anything, but I'm a very straight-edge guy. I like keeping myself healthy and clear in mind, and so I very rarely become tipsy. But yesterday I was lured out with some friends, so I'm having a little groggy head today. So it's quite a challenge for me to have this conversation with you, but I'll try. I was thinking to explore some of the philosophical stratas that is lurking in many of your books, which will help people, I think, understand, appreciate many of your topics if they get this deeper thing. And so let's just start with a so-called topological metaphor.
Okay.
I've heard you beautifully explain this to George Ann, and she was no nonsense. She forced you to explain it as simply as possible. And I've always been an adherent to the saying that if you can't explain something simply, you have not really understood it in its core. I have subscribed to both the notions that you should have as simple language as possible, not unnecessarily to cloak it with exotic terms, but also that you should have as precise language as possible.
You're right.
Because when we get to these more etherical topics, to the more abstract thinking, you can't detach language from realization. Those two things, as you know, are deeply integrated. So a precise but simple language is the ultimate ideal. So let's try then. The topological metaphor, how would you put it to us?
Well, unfortunately, the topological metaphor is an abstraction of an abstraction. There is no way to put it simply. People grapple with it, but let's approach it historically as to why I came up with this idea. If you look at medieval debates, for example, of God and space, you'll find something very peculiar, something very, very interesting. And this goes all the way back into the classical philosophers, Plato, the Neoplatonists, and so on.
Yeah, fortunately, I'm a bit educated there, so yeah. Well,
it even goes into systems of Eastern religion, Taoism, Hinduism, and so on. This metaphor is quite literally a metaphor. You find it everywhere you turn once you are able to train your eyes to look for it. But perhaps the easiest way for a Western audience is to approach it through what begins to happen in the Middle Ages, when this is first starting to be realized. And by realized, I mean consciously looked at, rather than something so obvious it's taken for granted.
Or carried by underground groups like Templars.
Or carried by underground groups, right, exactly. Which I think happened in the West. I think it was carried for a very long time by underground groups. But if you look at the medieval debates about God, about space, you'll discover the very interesting thing that the language being used, the technical language being used, is often the very same. Let's give an example. When you look at medieval scholastic philosophy, for example, God will be described as ubiquitous or omnipresent. And if you turn to the same philosophers, oftentimes, you'll see them using the same language of space. Can you think of anywhere where space is not? Okay, so in other words, the conception itself is omnipresent. It's ubiquitous. So they begin to notice that the language for God and the language for space is oftentimes the very same. Let's give another example. God is oftentimes described as incorporeal or immaterial. Well, space, when you stop and think about it, is in those terms incorporeal or immaterial. And then the real breakout for this concept is that when you start looking at the descriptions of the idea of creation ex nihilo, creation literally out of nothing, all right? It's when you look at that term nothing or no thing that you really begin to see this metaphor break out in a major way. Because if you look at the medieval scholastics as they're talking about God, they will always caution and say that when we're talking about God, we're using analogy. All right. And that ultimately God is a non-intelligible entity. That is to say that he's a no thing, There's no category of thought or conception that totally encompasses. So the same thing, they notice, also begins to happen with space. It's a no thing. And before creation, what do you have? Well, you have a no thing. And let's bring it forward a little bit more. Let's bring it more into the modern age with modern physics and the idea of a Big Bang. Well, what's there before the Big Bang? Well, nothing, no thing. And this is where it really begins to break out, because...
Hang on, you're saying that in the medieval ages is when it's starting to become a conscious topic.
Right.
Do you see this in relation to the concept of zero being reintroduced to Europe about the same time? I'm thinking of this famous, in the Renaissance at least, this famous
Yes.
Italian, because with the concept of zero and depth or negative values,
Right.
they open up for a practical understanding of this
Oh, yes.
no thing. So
Yeah.
is there a correlation there?
Oh, yes, I think so, absolutely. But the idea of a zero is not even itself quite close enough to this no thing. Mathematics has a wonderful symbol, which I've used to express this metaphor, and that's called the empty hyperset. In other words, it's a set containing no members but all functions. Okay, that's about the simplest way to put it. But when you look at it this way, when you look at physics, natural philosophy, as they called it back then, could not talk about nothing. In other words, you had to have something observable in order to describe motion in space.
Yeah, what about a vacuum?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. The vacuum, what's the vacuum? Well, it's another nothing. It's another no thing that differentiates itself. And that's the key word here. Because when you go back to ancient systems, you have, of course, within Christianity and Judaism, the idea of creation ex nihilo. You go back to ancient Egypt, you get very much the same idea of an all-pervasive no thing, which undergoes differentiation. And out of that process of differentiation, everything is created. So in other words, this idea of a creation out of no thing or nothing isn't really unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's pretty much everywhere if you know how to look for it. But now this is a key thing here, because let's imagine that we have an infinitely extended sameness. With that infinitely extended sameness, you have a nothing. You can't latch on to anything, all right? But let's say now, just imagine that you draw a line or a plane, that you cleave it, that you cut it, that you slice it, or to use the mathematical term, that you differentiate it. Immediately, when you've done this, you've created three nothings. Not two, three, because you've got one region of nothing that's distinct from the other region of nothing, and then you've got the common surface between the two, which is still a nothing. Okay. So, but now what's very interesting is you've added information to this system, and so every time you perform this differentiation, you can do it any number of times. What is interesting is if you symbolize this process with a kind of quasi-topological or pseudo-topological mathematical notation, what you'll discover is something very odd, something uniquely interesting and to me very exciting. And that is that the initial empty hyperset that you are performing this differentiation upon remains in every single formal description of every single derivative that you can deduce or derive from that process.
Like holographic principle.
Yes, exactly. It's always there, but the surrounding information content will vary. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means very basically that you've symbolized the process of analogy. Because what's analogy? Analogy is the way we human beings learn. We learn from a familiar context by noticing parallel concepts, structures, forms, and so on and so forth, from one context to another context. So you've set up also a process of what mathematicians call mapping, and you're noticing the continuities and discontinuities between topological regions, or we could also say academic disciplines. What does the rhetorical tropy of let's say, a reversal look like in music? Is there such a thing in music? Well, yeah, there is. Is there such a thing in literature? Well, yeah, there is. What you're setting up, in other words, is you're setting up the process of analogy itself.
Yeah.
And what the metaphor is really telling you then is that it is possible that reality itself, that the underlying medium of the physical world that we think is all that's there, is ultimately analogical in nature, and therefore an operation of intelligence, that you can look at this, so to speak, as kind of a topological approach to intelligent design, with a key codicil that this is also kind of a self-organizing process. So it has huge implications for philosophical metaphysics, because you can't pigeonhole this process into, let's say, pantheism or monotheism or panentheism or polytheism, or any of the isms that classical philosophical metaphysics deals with, because it looks like and has features of all of them. It's kind of an acid drip on all of these things. Now, the other interesting thing about this is once you see this metaphor unfolding, then you can start to look at philosophical texts themselves, or for that matter, Hermetic texts or mythological texts and so on, and see behind the language to the structure of the metaphor that's present in it.
Exactly.
And once you've taken that step, once you realize that this is all expressible as a symbolic language, it allows you to go merrily dancing and skipping from one context to another. And to do so, once you understand the process and have learned the little simple rules of how it works, it enables you to do so deftly. In other words, your analogies don't have the quality of being inept, but they have the quality of being quite apt once you see how the process works. So, I've attempted to model this in various books, but I tell people that every book that I have written, the reason why I tell people that every book dovetails intentionally into every other book is because that's quite true, because I'm using this process to write them.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Really? So this is a template for how you're writing them?
Yes, this is a template for exactly how I'm writing the books, why I'm writing them in a certain sequence, why I make deliberate reference from one to the other that may seem like the contexts are totally unrelated. But no, they are very deliberately laid out according to what I've tried to learn about this metaphor over many, many years of looking at it.
I'd call it a natural system.
Yeah, it's very natural.
You're imitating nature.
You're imitating nature. You're imitating the way the human mind works. Both, and I should caution people, this is true both of an individual observer and of group observers, although it's very interesting when you look at the group process when it's doing this type of thing. It arrives at analogies in the derivative system that are of a much higher order than an individual. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's very simple.
We lift each other. Is a resonance going on? Yeah,
It's a sort of resonance. A resonance, again, is a kind of analogy because you've got a fundamental, let's say, a certain structure or form that appears in one context. And then let's say you're an individual that's particularly adept at looking at these kinds of things, and then you notice the same structure in a very different sort of context, and then then there's a third appearance of it over here in this third context. Well, what happens in the process of analogy, if you look at it very carefully, if you start at one context and map to another context, or notice the same thing in another context, what happens is very interesting. You lose a certain amount of meaning from the context you're moving from, but you're gaining a certain amount of meaning from the context that you're going to. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Very simple. It's an obvious sort of process. Think of translating a book from one language to another. Well, you're going to lose a certain amount of meaning that's present in the original language, but you're also, what most people don't get, is they're going to pick up a certain amount of meaning from the language they're going into.
I've experienced this.
Yeah.
Because I translated a lot of stuff.
Sure, yeah.
And I translated stuff which is supposed to convey deeper stratas. And it's exactly when it comes to these things that you have a whole new universe. If you adapt in the translation, you can actually reconnect with stuff that wasn't in the original text, but was a parallel in that culture, in that language.
Right, exactly. This is something that anybody that's worked on translations will know quite well. Well, what I'm saying and suggesting is that this is true of all movements between any context and another context. You lose a certain amount of meaning, you gain a certain amount of meaning.
Not just languages, but any expression, any approach.
Exactly. Now, let's say this individual has done this through X number of contexts. Well, the interesting thing is, at the end of the process, his analogy is going to look nothing like what he started with. Okay, it's going to look very different because he's tracked it linearly through several different contexts. Now, let's take a group of several people, each of them looking at maybe one or two contexts and then pooling their observations. Now, in doing so, they may get to the same place that the individual does at the end of the process, but as a result of the group doing it, it's going to be a higher order derivative. In other words, in the mathematical expression of it, it's going to be a stronger analogy, let's put it that way, than an individual looking at it. So there's actually a group effect here. What I've said many times is a kind of a group multiplier effect that occurs. So it's not true in all cases, but that's just kind of a simplistic illustration of this. But the fact remains that if you're starting from this initial no thing, that in each and every stage of the process, that initial no thing remains as part of the formal description of the process. And when you look at it very carefully, what distinguishes, I'll kind of tease the listeners here, because what distinguishes, in my thinking, analogical from logical deduction from induction is simply the way that this is notated symbolically. In other words, each of those three very different types of human reasoning processes has basically the same formal structure as part of its description. What is different in each case is where that original null context or empty hyperset actually appears in the notation. So what it also is suggesting is that there is an ultimate, if you will, similarity of form between supposedly these three supposedly discrete types of thought.
These three being logical and inductive and deductive, right?
Being deductive, inductive, and analogical.
Analogical.
Analogical simply means a direct mapping from a specific context to another context.
Yeah, like a metaphor. Yeah.
Like a metaphor, exactly. So yeah, these things, it's fascinating stuff, you know.
And that's the most intuitive, by the way.
It is the most intuitive, yes, it is. Because there is this innate ability that I think all humans have. And this is why, I think it was good to start out with education, because good education trains the mind how to recognize these things. And there's another thing that we need to be aware of. Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, had the idea of innate grammatical competence. We're all born with the capacity to learn languages because ultimately all languages have very, very similar elements.
Oh, I think this is scientifically confirmed now, by the way.
Yeah, it is. It is. But what's more interesting, as far as I'm concerned, is I think using Chomsky's idea, I think we are all born with an innate analogical competence. All right. And the reason why I think that is because if you look at human beings, when we're talking with each other, for example, we'll get into a discussion where someone makes an analogy, and what immediately ensues? Well, someone will say, well, I don't agree. Your analogy doesn't hold because of such and such. In other words, we all have a sense of what an inept analogy is, a clumsy one. Yeah. But we all, by the same token, have a sense of what constitutes a good analogy. Now, the real trick is, can that be formally specified? Can we turn the light of reason to look at that question more closely and see if there is something that distinguishes an apt from it?
Like a pattern?
Yeah, a
method?
Yeah, a method, exactly. So again, this metaphor idea, I think, kind of hints at that possibility as well. So it's a very long way to go around Harvey's barn, but it's a very powerful tool. Yeah. Once you've perceived what it is, the difficulty most people have is being able to clear away the informal technical jargon and looking at the symbolism itself and seeing that it's really symbolizing an underlying structure behind a lot of these things. I think previously we've talked in some of your interviews about the fact that I think that three very famous mathematicians were getting very close to recognizing this. Have we talked about Newton and Descartes and Leibniz in this respect?
I've heard you talk with Georgiana about it, though. So yeah.
Well, let me read you some quotations here. I want you to listen to these very, very carefully. Okay. All right, because these are the indicators. This is from a little book of mine that I and Scott DeHart wrote, called Talk Radio for the Eyes, Transhumanism and Dialogue, because we got a lot of questions from people about the transhumanism.
Yeah, I've noticed that little sly little book that has come out there under the radar. Yeah, I noticed it the other day. Yeah, it's an interesting book.
Well, now listen to this. This is an actual quotation, and I'll read it, and then I'll tell you who said it. But listen carefully to what this person is actually saying. You'll recognize who it is once I say the name right away.
Okay.
Quote, we see that the old geometers have made a use of a kind of analysis which they extended to the solution of all problems, albeit they have hidden it from posterity. I well realize that they must have known a kind of mathematics that was very different from today's common one. Not that I think they knew it perfectly. And indeed, some traces of this true mathematics seem to me still to appear in Pappus et Diopantagus, who, though not belonging to the most ancient ages, lived many centuries before our times. I would also think that later on it was suppressed by its very authors because of a certain wicked slyness, unquote. Now, guess who that was?
Newton?
No, that was Descartes.
That was Descartes. But both of them were aware of the ancient...
Well, hang on. What Descartes has just said. Now, let's remember who Descartes is. This is the guy that has invented analytical geometry, basically laid the foundations for linear algebra, all right? And what he's telling you is, I'm reading these ancient mathematicians, and I think they had a form of analysis that is lost to us.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
And that has been suppressed. Okay.
Oh, even suppressed. So it's not even just suppressed. That it's lost, but they don't want us to know about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, here's another quotation. Quote, to be sure, the ancients' method is more elegant by far than the Cartesian one, for Descartes achieved the result by an algebraic calculus which transfused into words following the practice of the ancients in their writings would prove to be so tedious and entangled as to provoke nausea, nor might it be understood. but they accomplished it by certain simple propositions, judging that nothing written in a different style was worthy to be read, and in consequence, concealing the analysis by which they found their construction, unquote. Now, guess who that was?
It was Newton and...
That was Newton.
That was Newton, okay. Yeah.
That was Newton. And again, what's he saying? Well, if you look at these ancient mathematicians, they've got some form of analysis which they've concealed from us.
Yeah, so he agreed.
Yeah. And this is one of the inventors of the calculus here, folks. Yeah. All right, now here's the whopper. This is the one I think that really came very close to recognizing what I've been calling topological metaphor. He says, quote, "The ancients seem to have recognized and possessed such an analysis proper to geometry, for in their works I think I can make out some vestiges of it, namely," listen carefully, "namely of an algebra in which numbers are not the issue. Certainly it is by this art that they unfolded those propositions, otherwise we would not have had them for such a long time, which only with difficulty would we find by using our modern methods. I think I've attained and discovered the foundation and first lineaments of this art, with which we can obtain everything else by an imitation of calculating, and with no need to follow the lines with our imagination, a result which I am not sure the ancients ever attained," unquote. Now, guess who that was? That was Leibniz, the other inventor of the calculus. Yeah. So in other words, he's telling you something even beyond what Descartes and Newton are telling you.
You can use the mathematical language for other areas than maths.
Exactly. He's saying that there is a symbolic way. Yeah. There is a way of symbolizing pure analysis. And in fact, Leibniz actually, in his writings, if you really dig into him, came up with what he called analysis situ. In other words, analysis of the situation, which is as close to topology as any 17th century mathematician came. And again, he also came up with the idea of what he called a characteristica universalis, a universal characteristic or a universal calculus that would allow you to move in any discipline with ease. And of course, he was busily trying to invent this. And I suspect that what they are looking at is the same thing of what I've been calling topological metaphor, this idea of a nothing that is differentiated and information added to the system that is ultimately driving creation, that is analogical in nature, that is modeling simultaneously not only nature but thought itself. So it's a very, very interesting thing that they're suggesting, because all three of them are also suggesting that this was suppressed for some reason.
Yeah. Before you take it further, because oh my God, there's so many. Despite my hangover, I have so many associations here. We can't touch them all. But although everything you're saying is, for me, easy to follow, if we just divided what you were saying in simple sentences, but it's all have to come together. So let me see here. I'm thinking that if you use the topological as a metaphor, you're basically using the geometrical approach. And like Pythagoras said, in the beginning, God geometrized. Now, you're saying something very important here, and that is through symbol. Because when I look in history, what I see is that all religions, or better philosophical systems, and especially the oldest ones all over the world, the older they get, the more similar they are. Yeah. They use symbolism as the way to convey this. They are not intellectualizing it as you and I am doing now by discussing it. Right. Because this is so abstract that it's, you have the saying in English that a picture says more than 1,000 words, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Now, a symbol says more than 1,000 pictures. So when you get at this deeper level, we kind of leave the rational cognition and we come into a much more creative way of thinking. And if we use math as a language, because like the scientists say that if there was one language that could be understood by any kind of life form, no matter where in the cosmos you are, no matter where in the dimensions you are. It would be math.
Right.
And math is an expression of symbolism.
Yes.
So let's see here. What you're talking about is actually the creation. Because I see this thing in all creational systems, and I see it even in the Judeo-Christian system where they talk about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's
Exactly.
the same thing. In Indian, they talk about Vishnu, Brahma, Shiva. The same in
Right.
Egyptian, Isis, Osiris, and Harpocrates. So it's space, and space has 3 dimensions.
Right. Mhm.
So it goes straight from nothing to 3, and it bypasses 2,
Right, yes.
2. And the Pythagoreans said, they call it, in the most superficial accounts, it was evil.
Well,
they avoided 2.
well,
because 2 didn't exist in nature, they said.
Even in some of the Greek fathers, you have the expression in St. Gregory of Nazianzus when he's talking about the Trinity.
Yeah.
He actually says there is no middle step of 2.
Right. It's an evil dualism.
It's a dualism that is not there. So the other thing about this metaphor is, in a certain sense, you're creating not a binary system. You're creating a ternary sort of logical system.
But actually it's 4, because first you have 0, which is in its own worth something, which is nothing. Then you have 1, God awakens from his sleep, from 0 to 1. 0 and 1 is actually the same. It's just the only difference between 0 and 1 is the dot in the middle of the circle, right? That's the only, it's the I awakening. So you have 0 and you have 1, which is the same, but there are 2 different states of the same, right? So, and then you go from 1 to 3.
Mm-hmm.
And you have 2 just as a conceptual bridge between 1 and 3. That means 4 altogether.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the other interesting, odd thing about this metaphor, because when you start looking at it or playing with it, it actually gives rise to numbers. So, in other words, in the order of concepts of this thing, this is the other part of the metaphor that's so fascinating, is that there is an order of concepts and how and when they emerge. So, and that's, that whole thing is a very Egyptian idea, you can go back.
Yeah. My approach to this, before I noticed you wrote about it, has been the Egyptian, Greek, the numbers approach.
Right.
And I concede the geometrical approach is just as valid, if not better. So there we have 2 different ways to understand these things.
Yeah,
even there.
The metaphor. It's important that people understand that the metaphor is a metaphor. In other words, it's yet another analogy for something that ultimately transcends analogy. But we humans can only talk about things analogically. So, it kind of explains, it's a both and situation. It kind of explains that whole process in itself. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. Symbols are absolutely key and crucial here. And this is why, at least in my approach to try and symbolize this whole thing, I chose topology as the way to do it. Because it has, again, with that empty hyperset symbol in mathematical notation, that's almost a perfect symbol because it's a 0 with a line through it. So in other words, you're not even willing to go to the idea of 0 as being adequate for this. It's the old expression of a famous Eastern Orthodox saint by the name of Gregory Palamas, who just throws most people into a tailspin, because he'll say things like, well, if the world exists, God does not, and if God exists, the world does not.
Because you have the same problem with the 0, because as soon as you have this encircling line, this circle, right? Then you have something, then you have limited it.
Yeah, exactly.
So 0 should really be nothing, but then you can't use it practically because there's nothing there.
So it's a very, very rich concept, and symbols. I think it was Schwaller de Lubitsch that pointed out that the Egyptian hieroglyphs are really symbols of this whole analogical process, because you have to sit and study them.
Yeah.
You can't just look at them and look them up in a dictionary and say, well, this symbol means this. No,
it's not learning by memorization.
Because these ancient languages, the academic term for it is paranomasia, which means that they function on a multitude of levels simultaneously.
Could you repeat that word?
Paranomasia.
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 So para means over,
Mm-hmm.
and what's the root word for the rest there?
Words.
Oh, right, beyond words. Yeah.
It's the idea of conveying a multitude of levels at the same time. In other words,
right.
Ancient languages are designed, so to speak, if I can draw yet another analogy, to be rather similar to, let's say, a fugue by Bach.
Right.
They're functioning on a multitude of levels independently, but simultaneously, harmoniously with each other. In other words, it's not simply one melody propped up by a chord with, a drum beat in the background. That's the way most of us think of language, functioning on one level to convey one level of meaning.
Yeah.
But if you've studied ancient texts, the difficulty is that you're dealing with languages that were trying to convey multiple levels of meaning at the same time.
Yes.
This is my big beef, quite honestly, with modern Bible translations, because the translational philosophy is to convey the simplest meaning that's there. But if you look at the Greek of the New Testament, you're oftentimes confronted with expressions that carry two or three or more meanings simultaneously.
Yeah, like in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, I know that if you look at the original Greek word for word,
right.
I forgot what that word was, but it's actually logos in the original Greek. The problem with logos is that if they meant the word as a colloquial expression of something you're saying, right?
Right?
They wouldn't use logos. They would use this other Greek word that I forgot.
They'd use the word rima for that.
Yeah. Whereas logos can mean idea.
Yes.
It can mean law.
Yes.
It can mean teaching. It can mean so many things.
Yes.
And let me just quickly interject too that if you look at the so-called holy languages, the ancient languages,
right,
you'll see that, like in the hieroglyphs, you see that one letter is an expression of a number, of a sound, of a meaning, of a word, of an image. I mean, they have these multi-layers. So how do we know? So that means that any text you have,
right,
and the same goes for runes, the same goes for Sanskrit. It means that any text you have can have a multiple layer of meaning they want to convey to us.
Absolutely. And
it gets lost by the academicians usually.
Well, it gets lost because our culture is not, if I can use the analogy, our culture is not a contrapuntal culture. And again, I've said many times to people on the website, in the members area, in various interviews, that if you are able to listen intelligently to, let's say, the music of a Bach, you are much more able, because you're listening to several lines, independent lines of music moving together. You are much more able to approach these ancient languages and listen to them in the same way, because that's what they're doing. They're contrapuntal languages. They are moving on several different staves of the score, so to speak, at the same time.
So your training in playing Bach and listening to Bach has actually helped your understanding of this metaphor.
Absolutely.
Because he applies the same principles music-wise.
Oh, absolutely. He not only applies them, but I'll go you one further. You probably haven't got to that part of Thrice Great Hermetica, but I spent some time in that book with the two Bachs that I so adore, Johann Sebastian and Carl Philipp Emanuel. The reason I spent the time with them is because I wanted to point out to people that when you read the music theory texts of that era in Germany, they are full of alchemical terms.
Right.
So in other words, you're listening to a kind of musical alchemy when you're listening to.
It's true. So many musicians in Germany at the time.
Oh yeah.
Were either, for instance, they were Masons,
yes,
or they studied these spiritual doctrines.
Right.
So yeah, there would be, and many of them composed plays meant to convey a ritual approach to this.
Absolutely.
What you call a topological metaphor.
Absolutely. You know, when they talk about the idea of a motif, you know, and then Bach will use the term Fortspinnung, spinning it forth. In other words, picking out all the latent meaning in that musical form. When they talk about permutation or transmutation of a motif, they're using deliberately alchemical words to describe an intelligible, rational process that they are bringing to their music. So this is why you have the idea in that era of affect, A-F-F-E-K-T in the German. It's a very peculiar word, because what it means is what they're trying to do is come up with precise musical formulae to convey an objectified emotion, a kind of platonic emotion. Wow. It's an emotion that the composer, the performer, and listeners all enter into. So in other words, it's not simply like the Romantic era composers. They're not trying to communicate their subjective perspective on something. They're trying to enter into a much more objective experience.
And the same was done by the great painters, by the way.
Oh, absolutely.
Raphael, Michelangelo, just another medium, the visual medium. But would you say then that this ingenious music system was kind of actually, you can call it a kind of a scientific instrument to influence the consciousness?
Yeah, there's that's a very, very profound observation, I think, because it was echoed by Sir John Eliot Gardner did this little documentary of the life of Johann Sebastian Bach, and in it he interviews a variety of people. And he interviewed, I believe it was a mathematician at Cambridge, and she said something that just floored me, that was so dead on. She said, well, J.S. Bach is a scientist and a mathematician who's chosen to work in the language of music. And it's the same, you know, Michelangelo, Raphael, Rembrandt, Poussin, Velasquez, all of these people are taking that very same similar sort of hermetic approach to this and applying these very abstract concepts in a very deliberate, well thought out way in the craft of their art. And it's very difficult, you know, with the modern culture that we only listen to each other or to our music on one level and listen merely as passive receptors to someone else's quote unquote subjective artistic vision.
I think you can withdraw the word artistic from there, but yeah.
Well, yeah.
Subjective,
in many cases, not all of them, but in many cases.
No, but for me, art is being a magician. It is to lift you in touch with the essence of existence, like these people did. And I'd venture that the painters were actually using the topological metaphor more than the musicians, because...
Well, this is particularly true. It's particularly true in the sacred geometry that you can find in Michelangelo or Nicholas Poussin.
Because music uses time. Like Pythagoras said, music is numbers in time, whereas geometry is numbers in space. And so the spatial approach is easier to understand from a visual approach. And the musical is a more masculine. That's more time, the time component, as I see it.
But it's the same principle that we're seeing, you know, the sacred geometry, you know, being so many years in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you look at an Orthodox icon and they're full of it, you know, they're very deliberately.
Yeah, and Islamic even, and Coptic.
And even, absolutely. You find this over and over.
And the Celtic Church?
The Celtic Church, absolutely. You find it everywhere. If you know what you're looking for. I think personally, since you've mentioned the Pythagoreans, there is a thesis that I've had for a number of years, and I'll just crawl way out onto the twig of speculation here and toss it out there for people to think about. Our Western system of music, our tonal system of music, is, I think, first of all, Hermetic music. In other words, it's based on the idea of the harmonic series. If you go back, say, 1,000 years into history, you do not hear the same quality, the same sound in the music. And the reason why is that they had not figured out how to tweak the harmonic series, the basic, nature-given harmonic series, in such a way that would allow you to move in the course of one piece of music from one key to another.
Right. So just let me dumb this down. A musician at that time had to stop. If he was to play a modern song, he had to stop,
right,
then recalibrate his instrument, and then keep playing.
Right.
Because he couldn't tune it.
Right, exactly. When they found out how to do this, beginning, during the Renaissance, that's when modern Western tonal music was born. And it's not accidental it's coming out of the Renaissance, because that's the outbreak into the public awareness of Hermetic principles. So let's go back to the Pythagoreans. If you look at the Pythagorean musical system, the Pythagorean theory of music, they discovered this. They pointed this discrepancy in the nature-given harmonic series very early on. They called it the Pythagorean comma. And if you research it, it's all about music. How do we tune the instrument so that we can function in any given key without having to retune the instrument? So in other words, what I think happened was the Pythagoreans actually discovered this modern system of Western music that we take for granted. That's been the basis of music from Bach to the Beatles. I think they discovered this, and this was one of their huge secrets. That was
and it was so serious to them that
absolutely.
That and the reason wasn't in order just to sit and listen to good music. Although Pythagoras is said to have discovered how you can influence consciousness through music. But the reason was precisely because this is a metaphor to so much deeper truths.
Well, yes, it's a cosmological system.
Yeah.
And they knew this, they understood this.
Or as you actually admitted in a Bite Show once, you said straight out, I remember now, you said this may be the first attempt in known history for a unified field theory.
Oh, absolutely. And the reason why is, again, this the natural harmonic series has to be mathematically tweaked. In other words, it's as if nature is presenting us with a mystery. Can we solve it? And I think very early on that the Pythagoreans realized with their understanding of the comma that this was the mystery. And if it could be resolved by geometric mathematical means, which of course is how it was eventually resolved, that you would have a system of tonal music that would unlock a huge cosmological secret. So when I say that Western music, by tempering the harmonic series, it unlocked a cosmological key because it unified all of the overtone systems of the auditory part of the scale, and then provides a clue to, well, can we do this with the entire harmonic series, not only in the auditory scale, but the electromagnetic frequency scale?
Exactly. Now, can I just interject a translation here to people who are at my level? Because I'm really, the only reason I'm following you now is that I've studied this in both your expression and otherwise. Otherwise, I would be lost right now. So let me try to dumb this down then. Because people may say, oh yeah, but music influences, but only to a limited degree, because people with lighters and concerts and stuff, yes, you can cry when you listen, but no, this is much deeper. Now, granted, first is scientific fact that everything in existence vibrates. That you can't get away from that, right?
Exactly.
So if everything vibrates, then you have to understand what is the law of vibration? How does movement, vibration affect each other? Now, if you start to understand the laws of vibration, then you could start to understand the system of magic, which is that similarities influences each other. You have the resonance principle, the dissonance principle, the harmonics and stuff like that. Now, what you're saying is that if you can decode these things via music, and by the way, if everything vibrates, then everything actually has a sound.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that we necessarily can hear the sound. And I won't even go into the philosophical thing about the tree in the forest, but let's just agree upon that even planets make a sound. It's just that in order for us to hear it, we have to translate the range of vibrations into an auditorial range of vibrations, which is limited. Granted, cats can see some higher frequencies, dogs can hear some higher frequencies, bats. So it's not similar for all creatures, but we have more or less the same range of audible range. Now, if you know how this works within the auditorial system, you can influence other ranges of vibrations, like you're saying, the electromagnetical range.
Yes.
And that's when you actually have both a very heavy system of, you could call it magic, or a system of science, because it's the same thing, basically.
Yeah.
Is how to understand how stuff works against each other.
Yeah, it's a system of analogical magic, if you will. Resonance is kind of the scientific term for basically what the ancients would have considered magic.
Right.
And it's very interesting to note within the Western esoteric tradition, if you read grimoires, the magician is told to vibrate the names that they're invoking. Rather, in other words, you're not simply told to speak them.
No,
you're told to vibrate them. So in
yes,
other words,
and in the Samothrakian mysteries,
yes.
To be a high priest, it wasn't enough just to know the words and the tones and sounds. You had to be an adept in vibrating them. You had to have a voice, actually.
Right.
And now we go back to ancient Egypt, and I agree with you. The original pyramid was most probably a machine, most probably made by auditorial effects, most probably also somehow created auditorial effects. But even after they lost this Atlantean knowledge, so to speak, they kept the high priests preserved a ritualistic, probably losing many layers of meaning, but retaining a layer of meaning when it came to sound, because they used the pyramids in the decaying areas after it was a machine, when it was just a remnant. They used it for acoustical purposes too, in their mystery dramas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're dealing, particularly with Egypt, I think you're dealing with a legacy civilization where this knowledge has declined somewhat, but the basic principles and premises have been preserved. And you find this idea of tuning, so to speak, the universe, even in the modern plasma physicist David Bohm. I wrote about him in Babylon's Banksters, because what he was attempting to do was calculate the mathematical equivalent of the Pythagorean comma and apply it to the entire harmonic series. What is the exact mathematical interval that will allow us, so to speak, to move from one key to another in any frequency range of the entire spectrum? So in other words, again, he had this understanding that if there was going to be that kind of unification in physics, it wasn't going to come about by cramming together relativity and quantum mechanics. It was going to come about by some sort of frequency analysis and unification along those lines. So I've always thought he's one of my favorite physicists, because he had these kinds of sort of, so to speak, mystical insights.
yeah, and I say it's not a coincidence that Pythagoras and many other great ancient thinkers were initiated into the Egyptian mysteries. But when you mentioned this thing, do you think it's a coincidence then? I mean, I would say that quantum physics, no, actually I would say that superstring theory is Pythagoreanism on steroids.
Yeah, in a certain sense it is, because it's nothing but a theory of vibrations in two dimensions, of things on the scale of the Planck length. And when you even before superstring theory, if you go back to some of these very early attempts at unified field theories, Einstein, Kaluza, people that were playing with these theories back in the 20s and 30s. When you look at them, it's very interesting that they've all got certain things in common. They've all got a geometric approach in common. In other words, how do we take the geometry of electromagnetism, which is kind of a donut, if you will, and general relativity, which is kind of a ball with surrounding three-dimensional space warps, and put these two geometries together to come up with a unified field theory. Well, interestingly enough, if you look at Kaluza and his very early first attempt to do this, one of the interesting things is that fourth spatial dimension is in vibration. So in other words, even in these types of approaches, you still can't get rid of this idea of pardon me, of vibration. Pardon me. So you get this idea in the way I'm approaching it is if you take two sets, mathematical sets, and fill them up with members that they both have in common, what would distinguish them would be the phase that they're in, the vibration that they're in. And I think, again, this is a possible way of perhaps explaining astrology and the fact that, we're born at a certain place and time with certain planets in certain positions. This is going to create, if you will, a systemic vibration that imprints itself on you at the moment of birth. And so when planets return to approximately the same types of things, it's going to be like hitting overtones on your natural personal overtone series, so to speak. And you're going to be kind of in sync during those times. And, at other times you're not going to be so in sync. We all experience this. But my point here is I think that there's perhaps an underlying physics basis to all of this that we have yet really to understand or even examine because, of course, all of this is just pseudoscience, And...
No, but let me quickly rationalize it, because the modern approach to understanding how there can be a correlation between planetary harmonics, so to speak, and what happens on Earth is very simply, before they thought magical, they thought, okay, the planet is beaming a ray onto my skull.
Right.
But now they're looking at it more like, if everything vibrates, there are structures.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's the point with vibration. It's a structure of movement. Now
it creates an interferometry pattern, and that.
Yeah. So you kind of look at the sky as a clock. So it's like, okay, if I'm born at 2:00, now the planets will have this eternal correlation, and what happens on Earth will have this internal correlation.
Right.
And both of them are following a deeper root cause. So it's not that the planet itself is sending a beam to you. It's that the planet responds to the same thing that the atmosphere down here on Earth responds to, which is this deeper causal topological metaphor.
Yeah, it's responding to a structure of information in that field of nothing, so to speak. Right. And when that structure comes around again, or comes around in close,
it's 2:00 again. Yeah,
exactly. It's going to have those types of resonance effects. So, this is deep stuff, and it's as far as I think, Al, I think we're looking at the beginning of a very different kind of science, because there have been hints in the literature, as I've tried to point out in the books. There have been hints of serious scientists actually looking at this stuff and making these types of deep correlations. And of course,
like who would you mention who are onto it?
Oh, easily. There's a fellow back during the 1950s by the name of Nelson that worked for RCA. And RCA hired him to find out, why is it that at certain times of the year our shortwave reception is so much worse than others? And he found amazing correlations between planetary oppositions. And, then that's an astrological term, whether we want to admit it or not. He found that when planets were in positions of grand crosses, for example, that shortwave reception was interfered with. And, he published this and was roundly denounced for, indulging in astrology and so on.
No, but the study of cycle is a decent science.
Cycles itself. The study, Herbert Hoover hired Edward Dewey to study why we keep having these boom and bust cycles. And Dewey, having the resources of the U.S. Department of Commerce available to him, just started to put it all together, and he discovered that there are enormous long wave cycles. Well, what are waves? Well, they're vibrations.
Yeah. And
he was so fascinated by this that he founded the Society for the Study of Cycles and just started collecting data on every imaginable type of cycle that you could conceive of. And again, it's a case of dealing with waves, with frequencies, with phases, and so on and so forth. But
if it's anything the ancient did in their science, that it was to map cycles, phases.
Precisely. And again, what did the ancients tell us? You go back to some old Egyptian texts, some old Babylonian texts, and they'll both
South America,
the
sun cycles.
They'll tell you that these observations were compiled over thousands of years. In other words, what they're telling you is that the basis of their so-called, pseudoscience of their astrology was based on observation of tremendous amounts of data over a tremendous amount of time. And I'm enough of a text person that when texts tell me something, I tend to take them seriously, particularly when they tell me something like that. And when you look at that statement and then look at Dewey, doing all of his work for Herbert Hoover after the Great Depression, then you begin to see that, my word, for about 3,000 years, we have not paid any attention to this in any really meaningful scientific way. We're just starting, in other words, to try and understand all of this stuff and make some rational scientific sense out of it. So, I'm firmly foursquare against those who would just knee-jerk react to this and say, well, that's just pseudoscience. No, it's not. It's just something that we haven't paid much attention to until very, very recent times. And therefore, our approximations now are going to be clumsy. They're going to be out of the ballpark. We've got to start taking a much closer look at these things. I do think, I don't know if you've got to that part in the third way yet, but I do think that this is one of those secret projects that they are busily looking at, is data correlations between different systems and their cycles.
Yeah, because I was thinking about also scientists like Hoagland's favorite, what's his name, Kosarev, torsion.
Oh yes, absolutely.
These guys that are into the free energy stuff, that they're onto this too. Because you can't avoid it. If you're going to have a unified field theory, you can't avoid it.
Yeah, because the other thing about this approach is that what you're really saying is that there's no such thing as a closed system.
Right.
All systems are open to each other, and that brings us again back to this metaphor. Because again, if you're starting from that initial undifferentiated nothing, and then you start differentiating it, that means that in each and every formal description of each and every differentiation, that original nothing remains in the description itself. So that's telling you that every system is open to every other system that results from this process.
I just had a realization. Let me share it with you. I'll do it quick.
Sure.
In quantum, Amit Goswami said in an interview with him recently that it's so insane now in quantum physics that if there's no observer there to observe it, then per definition it only exists potentially. It doesn't really exist. So in other words, you have to have a self-conscious ingredient for it to actually manifest in existence. Now, let's translate this to the topological metaphor. In the beginning, let's say there's nothing. Let's translate that metaphorical to there's God sleeping. So God exists in the way that there is something, but there's nothing, because like quantum physics says, you have to have self-consciousness. There has to be something that knows that it's observing. So if you're sleeping, like Amit Goswami said, if you're sleeping and there's no one else alive around you, in that area. Per definition, that area doesn't really exist in the objective world as we understand it. As soon as you awaken, it does exist again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to wrap your head around it. But let's take that at face value. That means that when there is nothing, there is God sleeping. When God awakens, then there is something.
Mm-hmm.
And is that when we can say that limits are coming in, that differentiation, that's God observing itself, God being, quote unquote, poetically speaking, lonely, and wanting to, and nothing can exist outside of yourself. So within itself, it differentiates, it makes a mirror of itself as above, so below, and then you don't get two as you would think. You would think, okay, I get a circle and then a copy of that circle, like an 8, so to speak. No, but both of these things are taking place within the bigger circle of God, both sleeping and being awake, which means you get 3. Well, sorry for the rambling, but I'm so engaged. No.
Yeah. There's one caution here to place on this, and that is that observation in that view then becomes a defining characteristic of God. Right. And what the metaphor is saying is that there is absolutely no prior reason or rational principle to this undifferentiated nothing. So in other words, we can't say if it's asleep, it's awake, and so on and so forth, nor can we say that it's inside or outside of time or any of these other things, because these are all products of differentiation.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting if you look at this metaphor carefully, closely. That first differentiation itself is very, very interesting, because what it is in physics terms, it's describing a systems state change. Now, the question at that point is that a system state change inside or outside of time? Because that's what time is really measuring, is a system state change. Right. Well, the problem here is it's a both and. Because you can't say that it began to be. You can't say, you cannot say that it didn't begin to be. So in other words, what the metaphor is doing here is it's showing us again that ultimately our concepts that we bring to it break down. This is why you find in Western Christian mystical theology, and by Western here I'm including the Eastern churches as well, you find this idea of the via negativa, the negative way. In other words, you clear away for union with God, you clear away every category that you can, but yet at the same time they'll tell you that you can't. Precisely, you can't, and they'll also tell you that you cannot do that without the via analogia, without the way of analogy. So in other words, those twin things always work together. To forget one is to forget the other.
But let's examine it a bit closer here, because nothing. Let's look at the word emptiness or absence. Mm-hmm. That's actually something, because that's vacuum. Mm-hmm. But if I have my hands in a vacuum, I put my hands into a vacuum box, and the hands are separated. You could say that technically there's nothing between my hands, but there's still something. But that something is still, it's emptiness. That something is emptiness, is absence. Mm-hmm. How do we wrap our head around this?
Again, it's a both and. This is why this metaphor is so very perplexing to people, because people are used to thinking in a what I call an either or dialectical way. It's either this or it's that. And the problem with the metaphor is, and I keep telling people this, is it's a both and. This is why it's a 3-based structure rather than a 2-based structure. It's not a dualistic structure, in other words. And this is what's so very, very frustrating to people. to wrap their head around that.
Yeah, but they can understand it in examples,
right?
Because that gives the analogical learning.
Exactly.
Let's say photons. Einstein say that you cannot travel faster than light. Now, what we know is that every particle in existence is dual, except for photons. So, if you are going to break the speed of light, which is obviously possible, then the vibrations have to withdraw from the world of polarity and coming into this singular state, which transcends the dualism.
Even there, you see what the metaphor is also doing is it's a very non-local phenomenon. Because as I've said, in every formal description of every derivative, you have the presence of that symbolic notation of the nothing that begins the process, all right? So in other words, the idea of open systems, another way of saying that, is that every system is entangled with every other system. So you're dealing also with something at root that is profoundly non